here's your lady from the shed again. Hello amazing humans on the net. Another month has gone by and what an amazing month it has been for me when it comes to reading, because every single book that I read was truly amazing, and so I can't wait to share it all with you today, and we will jump straight into it. The very first book I read in the beginning of May was a play by Henrik Ibsen titled Ghosts. The reason why I read it was because I was going to see its theatre production in London. In this play, you have extremely tight structure. You have 3 acts, you only have 5 characters and 1 single location, and in terms of the timeline, everything happens in 1 single day. That's it, that's the setup, and yet there is so much packed into that play. It is just extraordinary how Ibsen managed to do that, because you have so many things happen on almost every single page. So you have key character Mrs. Alving, she's a widow. You have her son, who's a young adult, he's just returned from Europe. You also have her maid called Regina and a local pastor. And what happens over the 3 acts is that certain secrets are all revealed. And so you have these fairly ordinary people in this ordinary living room. Pretty much everything happens in that living room. But you have questions here that are being asked that are certainly not ordinary. And so the big questions that are being asked in this play are about morality and about certain morality contamination. Can morality be contaminated by the action of others and by the past? Also, there's a question around whether we can really escape our societal conventions. By the way, there are no ghosts in this play. The title Ghosts serves more as a metaphor. If I needed to summarize this play on a more sort of ground level, I would say this is a play about how a bad behavior of 1 single man can have ongoing consequences. And this is why Ibsen was called the big disruptor, because he was one of the first playwrights who introduced this realism into his plays. So for the first time, the plays were written not to entertain the audience, but to ask some serious questions around morality at the time. On a personal level, I was very much intrigued here by the character of the maid, Regina. She's not the main character, she's a secondary character, but it was really interesting to see how she was written and how she starts off in the first few pages as this very confident woman who has ambitions to break out of her poverty and her social status, but by the end, inevitably, her future is shaped by consequences of, well, past actions of others. And it was real page turner, so I highly recommend it. I have another book with 3 of his plays, including The Wild Duck and Hedda Gabler, and those 2 I'm very intrigued about. Oh, by the way, the play that I saw in a theatre in London, it was very well done. The acting was superb, especially the main character, Mrs. Alvin, was fantastic. And it was modernized because the whole set was as if we were in modern times. I really liked how they expanded on the question of sexual consent. However, I wasn't crazy about the ending, which was changed a little bit. Let's have a sip of tea. And on to the next book I read, which was Amma by Saraid de Silva. This was longlisted for Women's Prize for Fiction this year. We follow the story of 3 women here from 3 different generations. We've got grandmother, daughter, and a granddaughter. And also there are quite a few pages offered to the son in this book as well. We've got several locations: Sri Lanka, New Zealand, London, Singapore as well. And I love this story because of the way it wasn't sugar coated. I also loved it because of how it explored, especially in a very endearing way, the relationships between the grandparents and the grandchildren. So the relationships where you skip a generation. The first half of the book was very, very strong. Something that was done very differently here, where the trauma is very much revealed to us in the first few chapters, because often the way I read it in books is that you see the effects of trauma first. You don't know exactly what it is, you don't know the main character's story, but that is being revealed to you at the end. Well, here it is all exposed in the beginning, which kind of makes you go, oh my goodness. And then you keep swallowing these pages because the pace of the events and the events themselves are quite dynamic. But then the book lost a little bit of that intensity in the second half. Let me know what you think about this book if you've read it and whether you feel the same. I had very, very high hopes in the beginning of this book, and I did finish it, don't get me wrong. This is still a very, very good book, but out of the three that I read from the long list for Women's Prize for Fiction, which was Nesting, Amma and Crooked Seed, the other two were a bit stronger for me, and I'll talk about Crooked Seed in a minute. This book is definitely about women's survival. The few men that are presented here, maybe with the exception of the son, are described to us in a not very positive light. And underneath it all lies this great concept that lack of understanding comes from lack of knowing, because the struggles that these three women have in life, but also in relationships with each other, mainly come from the fact that they don't really know each other's lives and each other's past that much. There's also commentary on social failings, on trauma, on displacement and love and loss. And again, I just want to emphasize that despite the book losing a bit of a momentum in the second half, it definitely didn't lose its intimacy that continues to be there right until the end. You do feel after you finish the book that despite, I'm just checking how many pages, almost 300 pages, you still don't quite know the characters that much. And in an ideal world, I would love if there was a bit more drilling down into their psyche. But hey, this is this author's very first novel, and I am very curious to see what she's going to write next, because there's a lot of heart in this novel. Okay, next in May, I finished The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. I started reading it in April, I think, but didn't finish it until May. This is a big book, and I did do a separate review on this book. It's a 20-minute video, me swooning over this book, basically, because this book is just amazing. It still haunts me. If you haven't read this book, you have got to read it. I won't talk about this book anymore here. Check out my separate video on this book if you're interested. But yes, I certainly am still recovering from reading this, and I am still thinking about this book on a daily basis. Steinbeck, I am coming for all of your other novels. Next, I read the final book in Deborah Levy's trilogy titled Real Estate. I have mentioned before that I wanted to finish all three books in her, it's not trilogy actually, it's called The Living Autobiography, and so now I have done that. This is the third final book, and I will do a separate video on the whole set of books because I really loved her writing in this. The Living Autobiography is a bit of a memoir, a bit of a non-fiction, a bit of an essay on writing, a bit of a philosophy. It's a mix of everything, but the way she writes is just so clever. And so this was the third final book in the set. This was about her being now in her 60s, with both of her daughters having now moved out of the house, and she is now in this moment of time when she is looking for her place in the world. And so this is why this is called Real Estate. So stay tuned. I promise I will do separate video on Deborah Levy, The Living Autobiography. The next book I read, I don't have a paper copy of it because I read it as an audiobook, and it was Crooked Seeds by Karen Jennings. It's a very short novel, but it packs in so much, and I was truly taken aback by it and surprised how smart and how impactful it was. So we follow this 53-year-old main protagonist called Deirdre. We are in South Africa, by the way, during a very dry season. And so this Deirdre, she's disabled. She doesn't have an easy life because she lost her leg in an accident when she was 18, and she's been living on government support ever since. She lives at the moment in this temporary accommodation. However, she takes the grumpiness to another level. She is not a likable character. She is so miserable. She has this bad temper. She's very selfish. She is not looking after herself because she feels like the whole world is against her. But then something happens. The police shows up on her doorstep, and they tell her they found human remains in the ground of a garden of a house that used to be Deirdre's family home. And so the story unfolds, and it is really trickled to us in this perfect tempo. And generally the writing here is truly excellent because you switch between the timelines, but the way it's done is, like I said, with the perfect pace. The characters are very complex. If you take Deirdre, for example, we don't like her, but we also see her as a victim. There's also a secondary character of Deirdre's mother, and again, this mother is presented as this person who loves so much one child but then doesn't love the other. You also have a perfect mix of personal and wider political perspective, and you have commentary on the past that always somehow manages to catch up with us. You have the commentary on national and generational trauma and how overcoming the consequences of the past is to start with acknowledging certain events. And there's also very interesting commentary on privilege. Do we tend to see ourselves as victims, even though we are the ones who are the oppressors? Do we have a blind spot in that sense? Honestly, this is one of those books you could interpret it in so many ways, and it really did make me read a bit more about the apartheid and that whole history of South Africa. Very honest, very raw writing, so impressive. And I understand that Karen Jennings wrote a few other books as well, and I'll definitely be reading more of her novels. After Crooked Seeds, I read The Island by Ana Maria Matuta. This is a Spanish classic that takes place during the Spanish Civil War, or just at the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, in the island of Mallorca, where we follow this 14-year-old Matia. So it is supposed to look like this kind of coming of age novel, but actually you've got the whole political situation bubbling in the background throughout the whole story, and this is actually quite a heavy and quite a dark read. I loved it for its darkness. I have never seen, or I have never read, coming of age story that is this dark. You know, you have quite a few teenagers here that are doing pretty bad things. And again, this book made me go into a bit of a rabbit hole when it comes to reading up about the Spanish Civil War and how not entirely clear-cut everything was. It wasn't a black and white situation. I guess it never is with civil wars. I have included a separate review of this book in my mini series on lesser known classics. So if you want to hear a little bit more about this book, I will link it above. This does take place during a very, very hot summer. So if you are a seasonal reader, this would be great for the summer, but a bit of a warning, this is not a light book. I did really like it though. It felt like it was something very different from what I was reading this month. And my final book of May was The Secret Garden. This is a very well-known classic published in 1911. It was recommended to me by one of the readers because when I did my video on movies that are based on classic books, where I was claiming that the movies are better than the book, one of my subscribers told me that actually the book is a little bit different than the movie. So I don't know, after reading all that heavy stuff in May, I felt like reaching for something a little bit more uplifting, and so I thought, oh, I'm going to read a children's classic. And it is true, this is very much an uplifting novel. It's very heartwarming, it's very feel-good type of book. You have here these long, beautiful descriptions of nature. There's a focus on that healing power of nature as well. It made me think about another book I read, which was a memoir titled Hermit. It had despite being a very different book, similar vibe, and there you also have these gorgeous descriptions of nature. So if you liked The Secret Garden, I would highly recommend you read Hermit. In case you haven't read The Secret Garden, we follow a 9-year-old girl, Mary, who basically one day wakes up and she realizes she's got no one left. Literally the first chapter is titled There's No One Left, because her both parents die in India. They both die at the same time because of cholera, and so she is being shipped over to the UK to live with her uncle. And in the first part of the novel, we very much closed in that Mary's world, and in her consciousness, she is presented to us as this selfish little girl, but as she becomes less and less selfish, also the narration expands to other characters as well. The two things that weren't emphasized in the movie as much to me in this book were, first of all, grief and the destructive power that grief can have on human beings, and especially very young human beings, but also on adults, and how much tragedy, how much further tragedy it can cause. And the other thing that wasn't emphasized in the movie as much was, very interestingly, in this book we have some very direct references to the power of positive thinking and self-manifestation. I think this is the first fiction book that I've read that I have seen reference to that type of philosophy presented to us in such a direct way. This all happens at the end of the book. There are some fantastic quotes in this book. I love the one about how the worst thing that can happen to a child is for that child to never have their own way, and also for that child to always have their own way. These are the two worst things that you can do to a child. I feel like this rings very much true. And then there was another quote that stayed with me, something about where you tend a rose, a thistle cannot grow. So this is where that positive thinking was mentioned, how you have to somehow replace the dark thoughts in your head with positive ones, because when you think positive thoughts, no darkness will be able to overcome you. So yes, overall I feel like this book was a perfect ending to my May reading. So thank you very much to the subscriber who suggested I read this. In fact, I have collated a list of all the books you wonderful subscribers have recommended to me, and I will be making my way through them. I'm currently reading Orbital, which was also recommended to me by one of you. There's quite a few books on the list, so bear with me and I will definitely do a separate video on that. But please do keep the recommendations coming because I really appreciate them. Now, time for another special English word of the month, and in May, this word comes from The Island by Anna Maria Matuta. So I did mention in my review that this book has a lot of fantastic descriptions of nature, which in this book sometimes is almost quite vicious, quite dark and quite powerful. And not surprisingly, there are a lot of interesting words that Anna Maria Matuta is using in this book. I am sure the translator had her hands full when it comes to translating this book, but one of the words to describe nature was resplendent. I have never come across this word before. Let me read the whole sentence from the book. So this is page 101. Under the furious, watchful red eye of the great gold sun, we were bathed in a resplendent green. So I went to Oxford Dictionary to read what it meant, and resplendent is attractive and impressive through being richly colorful or sumptuous. What a beautiful word. And on that note, I hope you have a beautiful, sunny, resplendent day. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in my next episode.